Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the INGSA Global Week of Dialogue. We are about to start the live Pan-American discussion panel. My name is María Jarquín from the INGSA Latin American Steering Committee, and I will be moderating today's webinar, in which we will be discussing about science advice and COVID-19. What are we learning? INGSA is the International Network for Government Science Advice, a collaborative platform for policy exchange, capacity building, and research across diverse global science advisory organizations and national systems. I wish to start with some logistical guidance for our audience. Please feel free to use the chat box to share your thoughts or the Q&A function for your questions. We probably won't get around to answering all your questions, but we will be saving them and they will help inform INGSA's work going forward. So please do send them through. Also, I would like to share with the audience that this webinar will be recorded and made available to share afterwards. Please do visit INGSA's website, where you will find all the information and recordings from the Global Week of Dialogue, the high-level panel, the keynote, and the discussion panels from the different regions of the world: Africa, Asia, Europe, and of course, the Americas. So now let's start our conversation for the Americas panel. I am honored to introduce our distinguished panelists, thinkers, and practitioners at the interface between science, evidence, and policy. First, let me introduce you to Dr. Mona Nemer, Chief Science Advisor to the Government of Canada. Dr. Nemer provides and coordinates expert advice to the Prime Minister and members of Cabinet. And in the context of COVID-19, she has assembled a panel of experts to assist her in providing rapid access to expertise. Professor Rafael Radi, President of Academia Nacional de Ciencias de Uruguay. Since last April, he has been appointed by the Uruguayan government as the General Coordinator of a scientific advisory group created for the national response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Roger Pielke Jr. from University of Colorado Boulder and author of The Honest Broker. Dr. Pielke is leading an international team of researchers to perform an evaluation of the science advice mechanisms in the pandemic emergency. And Dr. Esther Orozco, Emeritus National Professor and Scientific Advisor to the Mexican Chancellor. Dr. Orozco is the coordinator of the technical scientific group that was convened by the Mexican Secretary of Foreign Relations as a response to the pandemic. Welcome, and thank you for being with us today. So before we get into the questions, and given your experience in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm going to ask each of you to please share in less than 2 minutes, how have you been involved in the past few months? And if you can share, what do you think has been the biggest challenge in terms of mobilizing and making use of evidence? Dr. Nemer, we would like to start with you. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. They're unprecedented time, that's for sure. My role as the Chief Science Advisor of Canada, as you mentioned, is to provide science advice to the government. And they've certainly been looking for advice and using it. So it's been a very exciting time here. My role has been to do both, proactive, in a way, some foresight, if you want, to keeping up with the scientific literature, the progress of the knowledge in terms of the virus and the disease that it causes, and really making the connection with the policymakers. Because, you ask what the challenge has been, and it has been, using science in real time to make actually public policy decisions. So these have been, quite unusual times. And of course, it puts a lot of pressure both on the scientists, those who provide the advice, and also on the politicians and the decision makers.
Thank you, Dr. Nemer. I turn to Professor Radi. Could you please share your insights?
Thank you for the invitation, and happy to share this panel and also with colleagues around the Americas and the world. we had a change in national government at the beginning of March. So while the new authorities were starting to accommodate into their chairs, the pandemic appeared in Uruguay on March 13. So this was an unusual situation because all the health ministries and other organisms was just rotating people, rotating the professionals. And then it was a complicated time, and a month later, the president decided to create an advisory group, an ad honorem, an advisory group mainly composed by people from the university and the research institutes. And we started this on April with the goal to provide, as Dr. Nemer was saying, almost instant advice to the government on this new disease, a new pandemic. And we assembled a group of about 55 scientists coming from many different disciplines and in connection with the rest of the scientific community in order to scale up, among other things, testing. And it has been an incredible experience, which has been very successful for the country. So at the time, I'm coordinating this group. It's taking a good amount of time, but the university was keen to let me do this on the meantime. And we hope to resume some of these activities in the next weeks, hopefully.
Thank you, Professor Radi. Now we would like to hear from you, Dr. Pielke. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to be on the panel with my distinguished colleagues. And yes, I am leading up an international set of teams looking at science advice in the pandemic. And I should say Maria is our team leader for Costa Rica. So great to be working with you. I am the team lead for the United States, and I will make some quick comments about the United States, which is going to be subject of a lot of discussion and research going forward. And I'll talk about the federal level, the state level, and other governmental levels quickly. The three most distinctive features at the federal level so far, number one is the abandonment, the complete abandonment of science advisory systems that were in place as of last December. The second is the extreme politicization of the pandemic and scientific agencies, such as Health and Human Services, Food and Drug Administration, and so on. And the third, and probably the so-called elephant in the room, is that it's been a public health disaster in the United States, mainly because of the federal response. Now, the United States is a federal nation. At the state level, there's a broad tapestry of responses across all the states. And all of them are informed by very qualified, super smart experts. But it's remarkable how diverse that expertise, the advice they have given. There's huge politicization in the states, in the United States as well. And the advice that's been given, despite relying on the same scientific basis, has been inconsistent across the states. Then there's other governmental levels, cities, universities, and perhaps most of interest to the American context is college football, American football, where we've seen that become politicized. We've seen scientific advice go back and forth. We've seen different decisions made. So the United States is, unfortunately, a remarkable case study in a lot of dimensions for successes at many levels, but many failures of scientific advice and decision-making.
Thank you, Dr. Pielke. Dr. Orozco, welcome. We would like to hear from you now. Oh, remember to please unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Now you listen. Do you listen to me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real honor and pleasure to share with the distinguished panelists the Mexican experience on the COVID-19 pandemic. Mexico has followed, I would say, three main strategies for face the pandemic. Beside, of course, of the work that the Ministry of Health is daily doing. What Mexico has done is first propose in the United Nations that all countries, independent of their social and economic conditions, can have access to the anti-SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, Consequently, Mexico is working in collaboration with Latin America and Caribbean countries through the CIELAC, is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, to assume more than assume, assure the access of the region to medicine and vaccine against the COVID. Then the Chancellor, Marcelo Ebrard, has made agreements with several pharmaceutical companies, such as AstraZeneca, to buy at reasonable prices the first vaccine that will be produced. And third, and it is where I come in, the government has encouraged scientists to hardly work on the production of a Mexican vaccine, independently of the availability of the vaccines in the world. This important action will prepare the country for further challenge on infectious diseases and give Mexicans the confidence that we are fighting in the fire line against COVID-19 and not only waiting for solutions from abroad. Thus, in this last point, Mr. Brad, the Chancellor, the Mexican Chancellor, invited me to localize, to find the Mexican scientists that would be working on any field directed or focused to fight the pandemics. And we have been very lucky because we found first 19 scientists, all head of groups, of good scientific groups, that were trying to develop diagnosis methods, therapeutic methods, vaccine, etc. Then we formed a committee that you have already presented, a consortium, to be together and try to put all what each one of these groups have to propose solutions to the government for the pandemic. The pandemic in Mexico has been hard. We have already 72,000 deaths and a high number of infected people every day. Now, apparently, it is going down very, very slow, but going down. At least it's not increasing every day. And we are trying to establish relation with everybody inside the country, outside the country, international relationships, scientific and technological relationships, to push for this vaccine, Mexican vaccine. We don't mind if it is not the first. We know that it will not be the first one, but it is going to be needed in the very short future, in spite of the fact that the big companies, the big pharmaceutical companies, produce one or more vaccines.
Thank you, Dr. Orozco, and thank you for the panelists for these great introductions. Now, I would like to start the conversation and guide it around three main topics. First, availability and diversity of evidence in the Americas. Also, the evolution of science advice mechanisms in the region, and if we have time, hopefully we will. I'd like to reflect a bit on science communication during the pandemic. So let's start. Dr. Nemer, as Chief Science Advisor, you are supporting, as you said, you are supporting the decision-making process in real time, and you have engaged across disciplinary borders. And as you may know, in emergency, there is a necessity to have information fast, which can create a tension between relying on limited sources of advice and also coordinating a diversity of inputs. In the case of Canada, 3 levels of governments. Could you please share how has this been managed in the Canadian context?
Yes, well, thank you for this very complex question for Canada, because like the United States and other countries, we are a federation. Health is a provincial jurisdiction, but of course this is a public health emergency, so it's the federal government also has an important role to play. we don't have in Canada science advisors in every province, so it just complicates a little bit the interactions, with local maybe governments. But so I've tried to mitigate this through different mechanisms. The first one, I put in place a science advisory group, as you mentioned, that is representative of the country. So both geographically, the diversity of fields, and also the diversity of genders, of cultures. We have many cultures in Canada, and visible minorities, and so on. And we're very attuned to the perspectives of everyone. And what the diversity in this committee has allowed me to do is to actually tap into the broader networks of each one of these, eminent researchers. So that has been, one area. The other one is as needed, to add to these panelist experts in specific areas. For example, when we needed to look at specific health systems, we brought, in addition to the scientists, practitioners as well, because we needed the sort of, reality on the field, how it's happening. And at times we've directly engaged with the local public health authorities, whether municipal or provincial. I think it's been a very interesting also exercise for both the government and the scientists, because there are misconceptions from both sides. So the governments think that researchers are unable to provide advice in uncertainties, and they will ask for more research, etc. But in fact, they discovered that the researchers are perfectly able, of providing advice under these circumstances. And the governments have also learned to ask questions, to ask the right questions of the experts. So it's been a very important and formative exercise, and I think it's going to have, I hope, lasting positive effects in terms of the use of science and science advice in government.
Thank you, Dr. Nemer. This gave us lots of insights. Thank you for mentioning those mechanisms and how you were able to coordinate with the different levels of government in your country. Now, I would like to reflect on the tension between evidence and policy, and maybe Dr. Pielke, do you have any insights into how international or domestically generated information has been used to inform the US agencies in charge of the response?
Yeah, there's always a natural tension between expertise and democratic decision-making. And one factor is that, particularly in a situation like COVID-19, there's an enormous amount of evidence out there. You just look at the number of preprints that have been published, tens of thousands already. And one of the functions of expert advisory bodies, whether they're inside governments, whether they're multilateral institutions, whether they're externally constituted, is to help sift through all that information and provide policymakers with some understanding of empirical or scientific questions. What's the efficacy of masks, for example? Sometimes these bodies, their job is to provide policy options. Should we open schools? How should we open schools? And so on. So in normal times, there's what I would call a democratic handshake that goes on. Policymakers agree that they're going to solicit expert advice, recognizing that may constrain or limit the possibilities that they have. And experts agree that they're not going to go out politicking to try to undercut their decision makers. This is broken down dramatically in the United States, and I'll just give you one example. Very soon after the pandemic emergency was declared by the WHO at the end of January, the US Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Department of Health and Human Services, OSTP is where the President's Science Advisor sits, they issued a request to the US National Academy of Sciences to convene an expert panel to provide exactly this sort of function, to weigh in on scientific questions, medical questions, and to some degree offer policy alternatives and policy advice. That committee actually worked publicly for a couple of weeks. They issued a few letter reports that were largely content-free and not timely. And since then, they've, for the most part, fallen off the map. And what we've seen happen in the United States is remarkably, by elected officials, the active effort to delegitimize, and I would go so far as to say to destroy the competency of expert advisory bodies, whether they are external, whether they are internal to government in expert agencies like the Centers for Disease Control. And just one data point to illustrate how pathological this can be for science advice. When opinion polls were taken of the American public in March about did they trust the US Centers for Disease Control, 86% of Americans said they trusted the CDC, which is good, which is what you want because they're an expert body that's going to be delivering a vaccine and public health recommendations. That same poll taken last week showed that 54% of Americans trust the CDC. So we're in a situation where the normal tensions don't exist. It would be a pleasure to be talking about the normal tensions of science advice. In the United States, we are in a situation of open warfare between elected officials and experts. And that's not a good situation to be in.
Thank you, Dr. Pielke. Interesting points that you have raised. Actually, thank you for talking about convening a panel of experts, because that's another angle of the need for the diversity of evidence that we need to face the pandemic, and especially a broader range of scientists are called in. So I would like to ask actually Professor Radi about his experience convening a panel, because well, you have been put in charge of the Key Science Advisory Group of Uruguay. And actually some days ago, you mentioned that, and I quote, a group of people unknown from the Uruguayan society became relevant. The role of scientists was made visible. So having this in mind, I would like to ask you, what do you look for when assembling a panel of experts in terms of backgrounds, in terms of skills, in terms of mindsets?
Thank you. One of the initial thoughts was that I'm a physician scientist myself. So one of the initial thoughts was not to consider that this was a problem of physicians only. So we first created a large umbrella on the health disciplines, ranging from nutrition, nursing, dentistry, pediatrics, geriatrics, mental health. So we tried to cover all the health areas, which was very good in terms of interdisciplinary dialogue. In addition, we moved also into biostatisticians, biomathematics, engineer modeling, and so we created a large panel with many, many disciplines. Maybe we were a little thin, but that was not our will. It was just the way we could assemble. We were a little thin on the social and economic part of our expert panel, but it was an impossible task to cover so broad. So that was kept mainly by the government, and the scientists kept, quote unquote, the health and modeling area, but with a very broad spirit. And so we created altogether a total number of 8 subcommittees, but then there were lots of ad hoc committees that we were assembled depending on, as Dr. Nemer was saying, if someone was asking the right questions, sometimes we had to reassemble the groups to answer new questions and new challenges. And I think that the people we elected had to have 2 main characteristics. Scientific excellence, number 1, and be able to do teamwork without being disruptive. We didn't have any time for personal show-off or personal disruptions. So these were my 2 conditions to the President of the nation. We will select people without political interference that will be at the same time very good on what they do, and they were very good and friendly people that is able to do teamwork. Because another important thing is that any conclusion we need to inform to the public. So we do not want a group of 55 persons saying each of them individually what they think, because that can create a lot of confusion. So early on in the process, we had an agreement with everybody in the way we would communicate without losing at all academic freedom, but at the same time keeping a channel of communication with the government and with the society that it was as clear and as transparent as possible. So I think that the process has been really well. We are all together still 5 months after the initiation, and these were our main factors in the creation of the group.
Thank you, Dr. Radi. It's good to know that 5 months after, you're still engaged with the community, the scientific community, with the groups. And it actually, that's a lot of value to our discussion. Now, actually, we'd like to hear Dr. Orozco experience, because you also had to engage with the scientific community. You are the coordinator of the recently established consortium of innovative scientists in Mexico, which has identified groups in universities, in research centers, and in private companies that could eventually lead to manufacture of a vaccine in Mexico, as you mentioned before. So reflecting on the level of preparedness and the evolution of science advice mechanisms in your country, can you tell us how this new collaboration that you are coordinating will change the way the Mexican scientific community will engage and will provide advice to the Secretary of Foreign Relations?
Yes, we know, and I think that I agree completely with the words that Rafael expressed in relation to the importance to make a team and to live for a while in a situation like this. All the personal ambitions or the personal thoughts aside, and put all the brains and all the words and all the actions together to try to apport, to give something to the community. I think that the team that we are working with know very well that now, better than ever, we cannot make good decisions without being well informed. Thus, people working in the team have to be very well informed on the daily basis, consulting the best journals, international journals, and bringing to the team the news that can help to advance a little bit or more, if possible, in the proposal of the solutions. Also, we have realized that at global level, we cannot face this kind of unpredictable events without international cooperation. I told you before that. We need the support of countries that are more advanced than us in the fields of science and technology. And of course, we want to know what are they doing and how are they doing and how people around the world is focusing the big problem. We have the fortune that the Chancellor, that Marcelo Ebrard, listened very carefully to all what is suggested. And each time that there is a problem in the panorama that needs of the science and technology, he calls us and we say what we think or what we know. And regularly he takes our words and apply the public policies in consequence. So I'm sure that the solution is in the teams, is in the ability of working together. The world, the advanced countries and those that are, Mexico has excellent scientific, as I told you, scientists, as I told you before, but we need international cooperation if we need to drink from the international knowledge to make real obtain good results that can serve not only for Mexico, but for our region and for the world.
Thank you, Dr. Orozco, for giving us an insight on the Mexican situation. And Dr. Nemer, if you would like to also jump in on your experience on assembling a group of experts, please be my guest, because actually I wanted to ask you something, because you are engaging with other countries' chief science advisors, dozens of countries, to discuss the development and the challenges of the pandemic. So given the knowledge that you have built together with this other chief science advisor, can you identify a relevant change in the science advice community when we look back on this past 9 months? And if so, how would you describe it?
Well, you know, indeed, we have engaged heavily among the science advisors or equivalent across, you know, many countries. We had regular meetings every week. For North America, it was 6:30 in the morning, so you had to be quite dedicated to be up and wide awake for it. These have been extremely helpful, because as we all know, the pandemic has played at different times differently in different countries. But it was also sharing the science, sharing what worked, what didn't work in terms of the measures, be it the testing, be it the immunities, for example, data and so on. So I think it has reminded us that we all live in, one connected world. And, I hope that as we move forward, we don't forget this, whether as scientists or as human beings. I think also that what this has taught us is to provide science advice, you need to have the science. So I don't think that we can wait until the next, crisis, whether it's a health crisis, an environmental crisis, or any other type of crisis, to assemble the knowledge that we need, because in many cases we're not going to be able to do it because there's so much speed you can actually put into getting the evidence and the science. So I hope it's a reminder for everyone on the importance of science, of all areas of science. And it's also a reminder of the relationship. There's a human factor in all this. Science advisors, when they talk to each other, they need to trust each other. We talked about the team spirit, on the expert panels, but there's also the relationship and the trust between the scientists and the governments, and between the public and the governments and the scientists and institutions as well. So I think we need to engage in a continuous dialogue of science, and of understanding each other's realities and each other's, abilities to contribute to the common good.
Thank you, Dr. Nemer. Actually, I want to raise a question from the audience that could be interesting right now. Now that we're talking about expert groups. And so we have a question that says, has anyone brought an ethicist into expert groups, especially regarding discrimination of group of persons? So please free to.
I'll just say that on my expert science group, we have, risk communication scientists, we have behavioral scientists. We didn't have ethicists per se, but then in every one of the subgroups, we have ethicists. So for example, on health systems, on the vaccine task force, on the immunity task force, on the task force that looked at testing and tracing as well. So they have been integral part of the conversation.
Thank you. Professor Rafael?
Yeah, similarly, yeah. We have a legal and forensic medicine expert, mental health expert, and human rights and bioethicist experts in the group. So they have really played a big role. Of course, unlike Canada, which is a very large country and very, as Professor Nemer said, with many different groups, we are a very homogeneous population. So that part of the complexity we do not have, but besides that, yes. And we made special attention on gender balance as well in all our committees.
Thank you. I think Professor Pielke wanted to say something. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say that, I mean, the question is a good one, and it emphasizes the importance of understanding science advice, not narrowly, but as expert advice. And ethicists are experts too, so are economists and political scientists and sociologists. And really, depending on the nature of the advice, if you want to answer a question, what is the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine, for example, you'll have a very narrow set of technical experts. But if the question is, what should we do with opening schools, you're going to have a very different and probably more diverse set of experts, and you will want to have public input through a number of channels. In our Italy case study, which is being led by Silvia Camporisi and Federica Angeli, they're looking at Northern Italy, and I don't have all the details, we haven't done the case study, but they informed me that an ethical advisory council in Northern Italy was one of the most significant bodies providing expert input into decision-making. So I think that's absolutely essential to understand the role of expert advice in how different countries responded.
Thank you. Dr. Orozco.
Well, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there are a huge department, huge direction that is in charge of taking care of human rights, not only in Mexico, but around the world. And she, the head is Marta Delgado, is always close to us and is always trying to put the accent on the human rights for the one side. And on the other side, I always prefer to work with women because I have found that they are more commitment. And of course, I work also with men. I have a group in my laboratory formed by men and women. But in general, women prefer my lab because we always talk about the necessity of giving birth and get married if we want to get a family, if you decide to, and to construct a professional career.
Thank you, Dr. Orozco. So 37 minutes have passed since the webinar started. I would like to remind the audience to send their comments in the chat box. And when sending a question, please remember to specify to who you'd like to address the questions to. Professor Radi, in the case of Latin America and with regards to the use of scientific capital, what has changed for you pre-COVID and over the course of the pandemic?
Well, I could only talk about Uruguay, in fact, because I see that there are very important and talented scientific communities in our neighbor countries, like in Brazil, in Argentina, and in Chile, but I'm not sure how much they have influenced the process, because our numbers do not look so good in these three countries, unfortunately. So I can, in fact, my colleagues in these countries are pretty frustrated in a way, in the sense that science has not been all that heard. So in the case of Uruguay, one thing that we have experienced is the validation from society. And for the first time in my life as a scientist, I have heard from the people to say that every time scientists communicate with the public, they provide calm and tranquility. And this is something that I have not heard in all my life before. So the first time I heard it, it was like an anecdote, but then we are hearing this every week, many times. So if with knowledge, if with scientific knowledge and expert advice, we could, in a very difficult time, provide calm and tranquility to society, that I think it was a very good thing, and a good way also to provide the right tools to mitigate the disease and to show to the society that this was going to be a process that was not going to be solved in 30 days. The quarantine was not going to solve this. And we said this since the first day. The quarantine was a period to gain time to prepare the system and to prepare ourselves, but the process was going to be long. So with a new government in Uruguay that became to the power after 15 years of another government, of another political and ideological position, this new government, which in principle was not so close to the university and to the scientists and the intellectuals, they really were very sharp and very rapid in asking for expert advice. And that was a very good move, and that resulted in a political convergence of everybody in the country. So unlike what unfortunately Professor Pielke was telling us about some type of separation in the political process that resulted in a separation in health responses, in Uruguay, I would say that the political, the health, the scientific, and the public responses were all overlapping. And this is part of the success of our low numbers, I believe.
Thank you, Professor Radi. And I have another great question from the audience, which is pretty popular regarding open science. And basically the question is if anyone went beyond expert to also include citizens in advisory process. The question is there any potential to combine the open science movement with science advice to go beyond traditional experts and use more open engagement with citizens and inclusive innovation practices? Dr.
Well, I think this is a great question, and in Canada, you know, we have a very important First Nation territories and communities, and they have their own knowledge and their own systems, and they've been really a very important part of the science, of the knowledge, if you want, and this is why sometimes it's better to speak of knowledge rather than only science. And more generally, there are a lot of rooms in pandemics for citizens' contributions to knowledge in real time as to, you know, what's happening, collecting evidence, and so on. So I think that you know, we need to reflect on this and see how we can incorporate it in more robust ways going forward. But I'd just like to say that if there was one way to demonstrate how important, you know, open science is, it's been this pandemic. And just imagine if we did not all have access to the same information in real time, to the same discoveries, and so on. I mean, the consequences would have been just like incredible and incredibly unfair, you know, for the globe. So I just like want to take the opportunity to say how important open science is, and to just like continue not the fight, but perhaps the path to it.
Thank you. Oh, Dr. Orozco, yes.
Well, I could go further than open science. I could say that knowledge should be universal, that all human beings must have the right to access to the knowledge and to access to the benefits that science and technology give to many people, such as many people, but leave a huge number of persons out of these benefits. So I think that the question is very good because it put together two things: the open science and the necessity of link the open science with the scientific advisor. And if knowledge in general were accessible to more people, we can answer the question and solve the question that is being done by the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Orozco. We are going to move now to the audience questions. I have a very interesting question about misinformation. It says, misinformation is a global problem. What steps are the science advice systems in the 4 countries taking to mitigate this problem? Maybe we could start with Dr. Pielke.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Obviously, science is a political football in a lot of different contexts, whether it's climate change or vaccination. And it's something that is well understood in this context. What I think is unusual is that we have seen scientific organizations organize outside of formal government science advisory processes to try to improve the quality of scientific advice. And so one notable example is the so-called Independent Sage group in the United Kingdom, which is constituted of academics led by a former chief scientific advisor to the UK government and former members of the agencies in the UK. In the United States, it's interesting. There have been a lot of organizations like Johns Hopkins Universities and others who have put scientific reports out and trying to clarify. But I mean, this is one of the paradoxes of expertise and science advice. If we have dozens, hundreds of organizations, each trying to clarify, it becomes a noise. And for politically motivated policymakers, for the general public, it becomes confusing and easy to just dismiss it all. They don't know what they're talking about. And again, this really underscores the importance of legitimate, formalized advisory processes. Science doesn't speak with one voice, of course, but being able to characterize what a body of science looks like with uncertainties, with areas of ignorance, recognizing like we do in the pandemic that we're going to learn, and what we thought a few months ago might not be what we learned today. I mean, weather forecasters have dealt with this and people trust them. And for up to this year, CDC was in a similar role. So I think that combating misinformation is one of the most essential aspects of formal science advisory processes. But I mean, it's not about science. It's about trust, institutions, and legitimacy.
Someone else want to comment on misinformation?
Yeah. Maybe I will add, two things. One, if everybody in the public understood the scientific method, what does it mean when you have a sort of, hypothesis and you have data and you conclude, and, where is the uncertainty and so on, because very often scientists disagree on the interpretation or on the collection of the data. I mean, if just like the scientific process itself, or method was understood, would all be further ahead. That's one. The other thing is, I think for a long time, scientists, assume that speaking publicly, or at least in certain countries, is akin to, becoming political or, diminished, actually took away from their focus on their work and on their science. And I think we've discovered that it's an area that if we neglect it, there is appetite from the public, to understand better. The public's become, at least in most of them, more sophisticated or want to understand, the premise of the conclusion. So if we don't get involved, I think we're leaving this wide open, for disinformation, sometimes for information as well. But it's a role that we need to be very cognizant of, and be able to partner at least with those who want to do it.
Thank you. Actually, I have a maybe related, very popular and related question. Dr. Orozco, you want to jump in?
Yes. Yes, I want to point out that now, as never before, we are facing a panorama when many people is better informed. Although information not always is useful and correct, we must be cautious with the information sources, choosing those that have scientific basis. Then it is necessary for scientists and for people that can manage the knowledge to put it in white and black for transmitting it to the decision makers and to the society in the proper language, in a language that everybody can understand. You were starting to talk about media, and I think that information and communication technologies have emerged now as the only way to maintain ourselves close to the external environment, education, commerce, social networks, home office, even in preliminary diagnosis for COVID. The use of digital platforms is necessary to contact people tracking on vaccines and diagnosis methods in finding the cure and the understanding of the disease. I believe that the power of the social networks and media must be exploited by the scientific community, especially for those considered as influencers for effective communication of science to the population.
Thank you, Dr. Orozco. And I have another popular question that can be related. Actually, the question is made by Adriana Castaño. Has science advice in the Americas been more influenced by political and economic factors than by scientific issues? Who would like to start?
The answer is obvious, no?
I think that, you know, it's not a homogeneous right approach because it depends on countries. I can certainly say for Canada that you know, we've provided science advice on the areas, you know, mostly related to health, but, you know, health related as well. You know, there is an interplay between economics and health. But if anything, the government here has come under a criticism that they haven't paid enough attention maybe to the economy and too much to health. So I don't think it's the same everywhere, but you know, whichever way maybe you do it, it's someone's not happy.
Thank you. Professor Radi.
Yeah, I mean, when we started this advisory board in mid-April, one of the conditions that this group transmitted to the president was that the group was going to provide expert advice. Decision-making was not our business. That was clear from the very beginning. But at the same time, we would not accept any type of political interference from either side of the political spectrum. So at least in our experience, things have been very solid and focused on expert advice. And I have to say that one of the big contributions of the group was school reopening. And actually, I believe that Uruguay was the first country in the Americas to reopening. We generated a large report that we discussed in 3 different episodes with the government, including the President of the nation. And we reopened schools as of June 1st. And things have been very well under control so far. So by the time the President of the nation announced it to the society, a school reopening, there was so much communication between the expert advice group and society that things were relatively simple for the government, and all the fear of parents and teachers to be among the first group of people reinitiating activities was pretty much calmed. And we, of course, monitored very closely with testing. There were 4 pillars of our group in the progress, regulation, monitorization, and evidence. And each of the steps every 15 days was performed following these 4 pillars. And this has been respected so far 100%. But now we are going into a second phase because the deconfinement process is almost completed in the country. So tomorrow we're gonna have a meeting with the President of the nation to see how we finish this first part of the advice and how we start a second phase where possibly the political decisions will be stronger, and then we don't want to be left behind on this process. So we need to reshape this expert advice for the next few months.
Thank you, Professor. Roger.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think it has some nuance to it. If the scientific question is, for example, what is the prevalence of COVID in the United States? Then I think everyone could probably agree we certainly don't want political considerations playing a role in how that question is answered. But if the question is how and when should we reopen schools, then the challenge is to integrate political considerations with scientific questions, because there's no objective answer to that. And so we need a different sort of expertise. And of course we want to consider, in the United States, it's a very, Texas is different than California, is different than Alabama, is different than Colorado. And so when we're making advisory recommendations at the federal level, of course we want political considerations to factor in so that the advice given and then the decisions taken are viewed to be legitimate and ultimately are more effective. So we as advisors have to know in what situations do we want to focus on the empirical scientific questions and which do we want to open up more to the public and political considerations, and let people understand that advice comes in a lot of different flavors and it's not just keeping politics out all the time.
Thank you. Actually, I have the last question from the audience will be this one, and it's a great one about capacity building. Would you recommend building the capacities of emerging scientists to help close the gap between science and policy? And what kind of training is needed for the next crisis? Maybe we can spend 1 minute in that closing remark, including Dr. Nemer. Yes.
It's an extremely important question, but we have to be careful that we're not creating like a sort of new breed of, of hybrid people that are half scientists, half politicians or bureaucrats or decision makers. I think what in my view, what this has shown us that the importance of multidisciplinarity and multi-sectors as well, and understanding the purview and the limits for each. It's as much important for the scientists, to understand, their limits and the realities, for example, of the civil servants and the politicians, as it is for the politicians and civil service to understand, what is it that the scientists can provide and what is it that they can't. So I think really in terms of education, a post-secondary education or training, it's this, multifaceted way scientists who understand, politics, and politics who have an appreciation and understanding of science.
Thank you. Someone else that would like?
Very brief. I think that is clear the necessity of a new generation of specialists.
Lo siento, no te escuché bien. ¿Puedes decírmelo de nuevo?
Sorry. I was saying that it's necessary and a new generation of people that can put together politics, can make an interface between politicians or politics and science in order to obtain a better communication of coming and going and coming again and going again. Our postgraduate programs have not this kind of how do you say, of areas included in the programs. So I think that it's time that we make stronger links. When I say we, I'm talking about the scientists, make stronger links with the policymakers in each country.
Professor Radi?
Yes, I'm going to advocate about the role of basic sciences, because this was a situation where it was a real situation that it was challenging, and the government required specific answers in almost a real-time fashion. And I can say that at least in our experience in Uruguay, from scaling up molecular tests to providing expert advice in different areas, to have a strong group of basic scientists from mathematics, biology, virology, molecular biology, genetics was essential. So you can have the most applied scientific response but based on a very broad background of basic sciences that are a prerequisite that you really need. Otherwise, we could have not been able to scale up testing. So many times our countries, especially in Latin America, basic sciences are seen like something exotic, something that is only for the rich countries. And we have been advocating for a long time that if you want to have a really solid scientific community, you really need to support as part of the scientific ecosystem, basic sciences. So I think that this was a premier example of how basic scientists could rapidly reshape their, basically their schedules to do things that are very practical for a country. So you really need that mindset also. So I didn't want to finish without advocating for the role of basic sciences and good scientific systems in the region.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Radi. Roger, if you want to comment.
Yes, and I want to echo that also, that and when we look at basic research, we have to be forward-looking, not backwards-looking, and be looking to the hazards and disasters of the future. Let me just say, one of the things that I don't think was on the radar of those of us who study science advisory systems is what you do when governments fail basic tests of competency. The assumption is that you're always providing advice, and that even though it may be contested or unwelcome, that there are issues at the margin. In countries like the UK, Sweden, Israel, and the US, I think it's safe to say that science advisory mechanisms haven't really worked as well as we thought they would. And we experts have to have a plan in place. What do we do as experts outside of government in situations where science advisory processes inside of government are compromised? And it's not enough for each one of us to get on Twitter or to advertise, our latest research. That just creates noise. So I think we have to think more deeply as experts as how can we better support democratic governance when democratic governance fails.
Thank you, Dr. Pielke. So this concludes the webinar, and I would like to thank the panelists for your time and dedication to the subject. 1 hour was so short, but it was an honor sharing this conversation with you, and I really wish you the best in the days to come. We will be following your expertise and actions regarding COVID-19. To the audience, thank you for joining us today. Please do visit and follow INGSA's website and social network on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, for more information and future events. And lastly, I would like to thank the INGSA staff for making this webinar possible, Grant, Lara, Christian, and everyone involved. Thank you very much. So stay tuned and stay safe. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.